for 10 lifetimes. I was always the one to fall in love first and chase after her, only to end up as a victim of betrayal in this final cycle. As the flames consumed me, I gripped the small bell she had given me while the system asked if I had any regrets. I thought death would finally be my escape, but then a familiar bell rolled off my hospital bed and into the hands of a girl I didn't recognize. She looked at me with tearful eyes and a gentle smile, revealing that this bell had actually been by her side through all 10 of our lives. After being transported into this novel, I did everything in my power to save the poor, mute girl from her tragic fate. We spent every day and night together, relying on one another, and we even made a solemn vow to stay by each other's side forever. But just when I thought we were destined for a long life together, a sudden fire destroyed everything in an instant. She didn't even care whether I lived or died, turning her back on me to grab another man's hand as they sprinted toward the exit. She didn't look back once, leaving me trapped and alone. As the flames swallowed me whole and I became a wandering ghost, I made a vow in the heart of that fire to make her regret ever being born. After I perished in that inferno, I returned as a spirit. I was tethered to Ava day and night, unable to move even a single step away from her. I tried to escape her side countless times, but every time I attempted to break free of this invisible leash, I would slam into an unseen barrier that knocked me back. The force of the rebound always left me feeling disoriented and broken. After failing time and time again, I finally gave up and accepted my fate. I was stuck with Ava, destined to drift behind her wherever she went. Late at night, the room was filled with the soft glow of starlight. Everything was so quiet that the only sound was the rhythm of breathing. Ava sat silently at her desk working on her novel, the pale blue light of the monitor illuminating her face and softening her features until she looked as ethereal as a distant landscape. Her slender fingers danced across the keyboard, making the horrific scar on her wrist even more noticeable. She had received that burn 3 days ago while she was busy saving Ethan. It happened at this exact time, in the same mall on the very day I lost my life. The flames and thick smoke had been overwhelming. Even though she was only a few yards away, she didn't hear me screaming her name. She simply draped her wet jacket over Ethan to protect him and charged toward the exit with all her strength. I wasn't nearly as fortunate, as the fire suddenly surged on my side of the hallway. A heavy section of a falling railing crashed down on my right foot. A piercing pain shot up from my ankle, pinning me to the spot and leaving me completely helpless. Not far from me, Ethan had been knocked to the floor by the panicked crowd. I gritted my teeth and tried to crawl toward him, shouting, "Ethan, I'm over here." But a moment later, a figure I knew better than my own soul appeared in my line of sight. It was a silhouette I had spent nearly a decade admiring from afar, an elegant outline I could recognize anywhere. Ava had arrived. The moment I saw her, a strange sense of peace washed over me, and I let out a long sigh of relief. But she didn't even look at me. Instead, she lunged straight toward Ethan. Her forehead was beaded with sweat as she worked silently and frantically to pull him to his feet. I screamed her name in a desperate panic. The smoke pouring in from every direction made my throat burn, and the suffocating haze blocked my airway until I couldn't make a sound. I was forced to cover my face while desperately shaking the large orange bell tied to my wrist. The copper bell rang out clearly as I shook it, its bright chime cutting through the chaos of the surrounding screams and cries. Ava kept pushing her way forward, her small frame trembling visibly through the thick black smoke. Her entire focus was locked on Ethan, and she didn't stop for a single second. I wondered why the hell she couldn't hear me, my mind going completely blank with shock. The fire grew more intense as another piece of the ceiling crashed down nearby. I gripped the bell as hard as I could, but the strength was rapidly draining from my body. The final thing I saw while I was still breathing was Ava pulling Ethan away, their silhouettes fading into the distance. The flames spread with a terrifying ferocity. I lost track of time until my blurred vision was completely consumed by the billowing smoke. The entire world went black, and I could taste the salt of my own tears as they ran down my face. Even in the moment of my death, I never let go of that bell. It was a gift Ava had given me years ago when I was preparing to move abroad for college. She had been smiling so sweetly that day, her cheeks flushed with a soft pink glow. She had personally tied that small, charming copper bell around my wrist. Since Ava was mute and couldn't speak, she had used her hands to clumsily sign her thoughts to me. She told me that I wasn't allowed to look at other women. She said that if I ever missed her, I should just ring the bell, and she would know that she was right there with me. Back then, I just laughed and humored her, promising to do exactly as she said. I teased her about whether all literature majors were that naive, telling her she already had me completely under her spell. Once I moved back to the States, we never spent another day apart. That lasted until 3 days ago, when Ava broke our promise for the first time. As my life was slipping away, a cold, mechanical voice suddenly resonated in my head. "User, do you have any regrets?" It was the system, the entity that had transported me into this book specifically to pursue Ava. After my mission was complete, I had chosen to stay behind in this world so we could grow old together. It told me that it couldn't save me in this reality. It explained that once my body was dead, my consciousness would linger for a while before finally detaching and returning to my own world. It offered to grant me one final wish within its power before I left. Meanwhile, Ava had stayed up all night writing her novel only to delete every single word of it. It was obvious that she was spiraling. Ava was actually quite famous in her writing circles for her short stories. Whenever we had a fight, she would write these dark revenge thrillers just to take her anger out on the male protagonist. As soon as I managed to win her back over, she would immediately switch her style. She would go back to writing incredibly sweet romances that made her readers feel cherished and warm. She was always so dedicated to everything she did. She would often rewrite a single chapter 4 or 5 times until it was absolutely perfect before moving on. Whenever she got writer's block, I would pull her onto my lap and wrap my arms around her from behind. I would help her talk through the character's motivations and values, slowly mapping out where the story should go next. On nights when her perfectionism took over and she refused to sleep until a scene was finished, I would make her coffee. I would whip up some late-night snacks and stay awake with her until dawn. But now, I could only watch her as she sat there on the verge of tears. All I felt for her now was a cold sense of detachment. I drifted right in front of her, my empty eyes reflecting nothing but pure hatred. I gritted my teeth and whispered that she was a heartless person who didn't deserve a bit of the love I'd given her. I cursed her to a miserable end, though of course, Ava couldn't hear a word I said. She pouted and pulled out her phone to open iMessage. The contact pinned at the very top of her list was JJ. That was me, James Miller. I hadn't replied to her messages in 3 whole days. The room was cluttered with scattered papers and sticky notes, so I drifted closer to her desk to see what she was actually doing. Ava stared at the screen for a long time, and then, incredibly, she smiled. She tapped on my dog Avatar, and a tiny smirk appeared on her lips. A notification popped up on the app showing that Ava had poked my profile picture. She whispered to herself about poking my stubborn head. She quickly typed out a message asking me to call her when I wasn't busy. A few moments later, she added another line asking if I could just let her know I was okay. When no reply came after a long wait, she hovered over the FaceTime button, but she hesitated and eventually closed the app with a pained expression. Before I had left for my business trip, I had warned her that I would be slammed with work. I told her the clients were demanding and that I would be on call around the clock. I mentioned that I might not be able to text back quickly and asked her to check with me before calling. After another minute passed, she couldn't help but poke my avatar again. A notification appeared saying that Ava had poked my tombstone and left a message telling me to get up and dance. I hovered near the ceiling, staring at the screen and laughing until I felt like I was crying, a cruel edge to my amusement. That was my doing. Being able to manipulate my phone was the final wish I had asked of the system. My first choice had been for my soul to be released from Ava's side, but the system told me that was impossible. For some reason, I had no desire to see how Ava would react to the news of my death. Whether she showed regret or utter devastation, the very thought of her emotions just made me feel sick now. Ava paused for a moment, and the tension in her brow finally faded. She covered her mouth and let out a soft laugh before typing back that my status was incredibly dark and morbid. She rested her chin in her hand and thought for a long time. She scrolled through her stickers carefully before finally picking one that showed someone aggressively rubbing a dog's head. She followed it up with a simple message saying she missed me. I reached out from the air to pinch her cheek, laughing hysterically at the irony. But as the seconds ticked by, the laughter died in my throat and my expression turned ice cold. I whispered to the empty room that I was sorry, but James Miller was dead. I wondered how a dead man was supposed to call her back. I asked the air if she had forgotten that I was standing right next to her. Yet, somehow, I was invisible to her. I reminded her spirit that I was supposed to be her boyfriend during that life and death moment. I vowed that I would never forgive her until the day she joined me in death. Today marked the 4th day. I spent those days forcibly tethered to Ava, accompanying her as a ghost. Her routine was painfully simple. She would wake up and send me a good morning text before diving into her writing. She ate when she was hungry and slept when she was exhausted, always sending a good night message before bed. But lately, she was clearly falling apart. She was restless and anxious, constantly rewriting her work only to delete entire paragraphs in a fit of frustration. The desk and floor were covered in crumpled drafts she had discarded. Another night, Ava jerked awake from a nightmare. I had been fast asleep until her sudden movement startled me into consciousness. I woke up cursing her in my head, wishing I could just grab her and give her a heart attack to get even. Unfortunately, I couldn't touch a thing, leaving me trapped with my unspoken misery. It was pathetic that even as a ghost, I couldn't get a moment of peace. I was beyond annoyed, so I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. I didn't know if other ghosts needed rest, but James Miller certainly did. Even in death, I intended to be a professional at sleeping. Ava was curled into a ball at the edge of the bed, likely reeling from a nightmare. Her breathing was ragged, her face was deathly pale, and she was drenched in a cold sweat. Because she couldn't speak, the only sound in the room was her heavy gasping for air. There was a deep sense of loneliness buried in her glazed eyes. She sent me a message saying she missed me, ending it with a single, lonely period. My phone vibrated as it received yet another one of her texts. Ava wiped her eyes and pulled a photo of me from the nightstand drawer. She stared at it for what felt like hours before she finally gave in and tried to call me. The phone rang a few times before the call went straight to voicemail. No one picked up. She gripped the hem of her nightgown and paced back and forth across the room. Her profile was so beautiful it was hard to look away, but her expression was one of pure worry and confusion. Her eyes caught the light, shimmering like a deep, dark lake disturbed by a gentle ripple. They were just as captivating and beautiful as the day I first met her. They hadn't changed a bit. I had spent 10 long years pursuing her, never letting up for a single day. It took that long to finally etch my presence into those eyes that had always been so cold and distant. I had finally managed to bring a spark of warmth and tenderness into her gaze when she looked at me. I had honestly believed that Ava loved me. But as they say, your true feelings come out when your life is on the line. All the years of love we had built couldn't compete with the first love she had been pining for in the depths of her heart. Ava, how could you do this to me? How could you be so heartless? How is it possible for you to stand right there and pretend I didn't exist? In your heart, is Ethan Brooks the only one who truly matters? The moment he is around, it seems like everyone else disappears from your sight. And I, James Miller, was apparently destined to be nothing more than a background character in your life. It was strange that a ghost could still feel pain. When I first died, I didn't even realize what was happening. I had instinctively reached for my chest, the place that used to hammer wildly every time I saw Ava. Now it was just an empty void, as if my heart had been replaced by a handful of cold ash. Ava continued to message me every day as if nothing had changed. Even though I was a spirit, The system had given me a shortcut to return to my own world whenever I wanted. But I refused to leave just yet. Instead, I spent my days coming up with clever ways to change the automated response text for when she poked my profile. I took a twisted sort of pleasure in messing with her while I drifted around the apartment. One notification told her she had poked my prayer beads and increased my karma points. Another said she had patted my grave and offered incense. A third one told her she had poked our thread of fate and accidentally snapped it. Ava's expression darkened as she stared at the constantly changing notifications for a long time. After a long silence, she finally sent a hesitant message asking if she had done something to upset me. That absolutely infuriated me. I couldn't believe she was still playing the innocent victim. I lunged in front of her, baring my teeth and twisting my features into the most terrifying expression I could manage. I swung my hand to slap her twice, something I would have been quite good at back when I was alive. But my hand just passed through her, and the momentum almost sent me flipping backward. I was literally shaking with rage. It was pathetic that, as a ghost, I didn't even have the power to slap someone. I hissed at her to stop using my name and told her to go crawl back to her precious Ethan. Ava's brow furrowed slightly as if she felt something. Despite the summer heat, a sudden chill seemed to wash over her, causing her to shiver involuntarily. She took a sip of warm water, changed out of her nightgown, and tied her hair back. This was the first time in 4 days that I actually saw her leave the apartment. The mall was decorated with pink balloons and hearts because it was Valentine's Day. The diamond necklace I had bought for her was still sitting in a hidden compartment in my study, a gift I never got the chance to give her. I didn't even have a girlfriend anymore, just my wandering soul drifting behind Ava like a dark shadow. I watched her follow a store clerk to pick up a strawberry cheesecake she had pre-ordered. Ava loved strawberries while I was always partial to the cheesecake itself. In years past, we would buy one and share it. I assumed that this time, she was planning to share it with Ethan. The thought of it made my blood boil. I tried to yank on her ponytail, cursing them both and wishing they would both get a massive case of food poisoning from that cake. Ava didn't suspect a thing, simply assuming that the mall's air conditioning was cranked up too high. She frowned slightly as she carefully packed away the cake and then walked into a men's boutique. Because of her difficulty communicating, Ava rarely went out on her own. Seeing her out and about like this was practically unheard of. A wave of bitterness began to well up in my non-existent chest. Ava was meticulously browsing through the racks, typing on her phone and gesturing to the clerk. It looked like she was describing Ethan's personal style to the salesperson. I was so angry I wanted to tear the entire store apart. I tried to spit on the floor in front of her, but of course, nothing came out but air. I looked away to try and settle my nerves, and in doing so, I missed what she had actually typed on her phone. Her message said that the clothes were for a man about 5'10", slender, with pale skin and a frequent smile. She mentioned he loved the color blue and that the gift was for someone very special. The clerk smiled and commented on how much she must love him. Ava's eyes, clear as jade, softened with a sudden warmth. She typed back a thank you, adding that he was worth every bit of it. Instead of heading back to the apartment, she went straight to the downtown hospital. Buying a gift and going straight to a hospital room to deliver it sounded reasonable enough, but it didn't seem like the Ava I knew. I wanted to ask her if she even remembered that James Miller was supposed to be her boyfriend. When I first became a spirit, I could drift around with ease. But today it felt like a heavy weight was pinning me down, making it impossible to move. I ended up huddling in a corner of the hospital corridor outside the patient rooms. I closed my eyes and covered my ears, drowning in a sea of frustration and resentment. I thought back to when the system first dropped me into this world. I'd been a typical guy with absolutely no interest in melodramatic romance novels. In the context of this book, the system had only assigned me a minor supporting role that had almost nothing to do with the main plot. Back in the real world, I had been the heir to a very prominent and wealthy family. Even in this fictional world, I was still a wealthy young man, so I didn't pay much attention to the actual storyline. My original plan had been simple: go through the motions, complete the mission, and get out. I just wanted to find a way back to my comfortable life in the real world. But fate had other plans. The moment I saw Ava for the first time, I realized that love at first sight wasn't just some cheesy cliche. I was 19 and she was 18. She had long, silky black hair and eyes that were both bright and incredibly gentle. Her features were so perfect, they seemed almost unreal. I couldn't take my eyes off her. Only one thought occupied my mind. James Miller was going to win this girl over no matter what. I decided then and there that she was going to be my wife and that I would treat her like a queen. After dreaming up dozens of romantic gestures, I started asking around to learn more about her. That was when I found out Ava was mute. People said her family had been so poor that they couldn't afford a doctor when she had a high fever as a child. Her vocal cords had been permanently damaged, and she hadn't been able to speak a word since. I kept digging for more information. The good news was that Ava was single. The bad news was that she was already in love with someone else. Her first love, Ethan Brooks. Then I checked the plot details the system had provided. The good news was that Ethan was the protagonist of the book, while Ava was just a minor character whose unrequited love for him was destined to go nowhere. The bad news was that Ava truly, deeply loved Ethan Brooks with every fiber of her being. Even worse, the protagonist and his leading lady were a match made in heaven, destined to be together. That left me, James Miller, as the pathetic third wool caught in the middle. I spent hours studying the timeline provided by the system to figure out how the story would unfold. But I became more and more confident that it didn't matter. Regardless of the plot settings, I was determined to win Ava over. After all, my character had been specifically designed by the system to be absolutely irresistible. I knew that if I put in the effort, winning her heart was a sure thing. I started by getting close to Ethan, eventually becoming his best friend. Once that was settled, it was only natural for him to introduce me to Ava. By that time, Ava and Ethan had already broken up. Ethan had moved on to his true love, Hannah Sullivan, the spoiled daughter of the powerful Sullivan family. The two of them were caught in a classic love-hate relationship that was as dramatic as it was sweet. As for Ava, her love for Ethan was so deep that even after their split, she stubbornly stayed in his orbit, waiting for the day he might come back to her. She was a mute girl from a very humble background. She didn't dare to ask for much, but she couldn't bring herself to walk away. Whenever Ethan and Hannah got into a fight, Ava would steal glances at him, immediately looking away if their eyes met, and then just wait quietly in the background. Hannah Sullivan was a wealthy heiress who had been pampered her entire life. Back then, she was incredibly arrogant and impulsive. On one occasion, she had even publicly humiliated Ava out of sheer jealousy. Ava was an orphan from a poor family. There was no way she could even begin to compare herself to someone like Hannah Sullivan. She endured all the mistreatment in silence, yet she continued to love Ethan with all her heart. She never once complained about her situation. It was heartbreaking to see a girl love so selflessly and deeply. Our first official meeting took place at my own birthday gala. Hannah and Ethan had come to the Miller estate to attend my birthday celebration. According to the original script of the book, this was the night Ava was supposed to be publicly embarrassed. Hannah was pointedly ignoring Ethan, holding her champagne glass aloft with a sneer. She asked Ava if she really thought she could play the role of Cinderella and suggested she had only snuck into the party to land a rich husband. She warned Ava that if she ruined my birthday gala, she would face consequences she couldn't even imagine. The crowd gathered around Ava was busy whispering and pointing, enjoying the spectacle at her expense. The poor girl was dressed very modestly and looked so fragile, unable to speak up in her own defense. Her eyes were filled with pain. Meanwhile, I was dressed to the nines, proving that clothes really do make the man. The custom-tailored suit gave me an entirely different aura. I smoothed back my hair and adjusted my watch, feeling pretty good about myself. I figured that with how sharp I looked, Ava would fall for me instantly and be begging to be my girlfriend. But as I made my grand entrance down the stairs, I saw her being humiliated in front of everyone. My blood boiled, and I clenched my fists, wondering who gave these people the right to bully my future wife. I loosened my blue tie and shouted from the edge of the crowd, demanding to know what was going on. The guests immediately swarmed me, trying to win my favor with flattery, but I ignored them all. I pretended I had never met Ava before and walked straight up to her, politely asking who she was. Seeing her up close, I just wanted to scoop her up and take her straight to a courthouse to get married. She was breathtakingly beautiful, like she had just stepped out of a masterpiece. I pushed down my excitement and flashed her a smile, introducing myself as James Miller. Ava seemed startled and simply gave me a curt, cold nod. I was momentarily at a loss for words, but I quickly grabbed her hand and told her that since we were both friends of Ethan's, that made us friends too. With James Miller taking her side, the surrounding crowd immediately looked at her with envy and bitterness. Hannah scanned me with a malicious glint in her eyes and remarked that Ava was certainly lucky. Ava gently pulled her hand away, her expression remaining neutral. Her eyes were cool and detached, like a still pool of water that briefly ripples before returning to its original state. She seemed completely indifferent to my advances. I wasn't about to give up that easily, so I warmly told her she could call me James. I admitted that she was exactly my type and that I really liked her. But Ava stayed distant, pulling out her phone and typing a message without even looking at me. She just wanted to know if I'd seen Ethan. It was clear that she was completely preoccupied with him. I gritted my teeth, but forced an even wider smile. After the gala ended, Hannah let out a derisive snort and asked if I was serious about liking Ava. Our families had always run in the same social circles, so we had essentially grown up together. We were never more than acquaintances, though. I didn't hold back and told her that Ava was going to be my wife, warning her that I wouldn't be so kind if I caught her talking behind Ava's back again. Hannah was clearly taken aback by my directness. She sneered, questioning my sincerity and suggesting that men like me were only interested in playing games when it came to women we liked. Then she shifted her focus and mocked me, asking how it felt to be in love with someone who didn't give a damn about me. I wasn't in the mood to deal with her nonsense. I just told her that just because her own life was a mess didn't mean she had to drag everyone else down with her. I suggested she was just venting because she'd been dumped by some other rich guy and told her I had zero interest in her drama. For the first 18 years of her life, Ethan had been the only person who was truly kind to her. They had grown up in the same orphanage, leaning on each other since they were children. I could understand the bond between them and the deep history they shared. I was a little envious, sure, but I wasn't truly jealous. I was certain that one way or another, James Miller would be a part of Ava's future. I was absolutely sure she would be mine eventually. From that day on, I started pursuing her relentlessly. I even went as far as learning sign language just for her and manufactured countless accidental meetings. Ava was an incredibly shy person, but that didn't discourage me. I had plenty of confidence and was quite persistent, which meant I was very good at sticking around until I got what I wanted. On New Year's Eve, she was all by herself in her little rented apartment. I knocked on her door for ages and finally slipped inside the moment she opened it. I told her I was starving and instructed her to clear off the table because I had brought a full New Year's feast. I told her point blank that I liked her, that I felt she was destined to be my wife. I admitted that I hated seeing her with anyone else and asked her how she felt about me, making it clear that I was officially asking her out. Ava probably never expected a wealthy guy like me to be so shamelessly persistent in pursuing her. As the New Year's bells began to chime, I signed Happy New Year to her with a massive grin on my face. I could see the reflection of my smile in her eyes, as bright as fireworks. I continued to pursue her for several more years. Eventually, some issues arose with the Miller family business, and I was sent overseas to continue my studies. At the airport, Ava came bursting through the crowd, completely out of breath. For someone who was usually so composed and detached, she looked quite frantic that day. Her eyes were bloodshot as she grabbed my hand and refused to let go. She slowly signed the words telling me that she liked me too. Hearing that Ava loved James Miller was the ultimate proof that I had finally won her heart. I often find myself thinking that if it hadn't been for that horrific fire, Ava and I would have been together for years by now, maybe even destined to grow old together. By the time Ava finally emerged from Ethan's hospital room, I was seething with resentment. I puffed out my cheeks and tried to blow cold air on her. Hannah was putting on her best act of being gentle and kind, quietly thanking Ava for coming. It had been years, and it seemed like Hannah had learned to be a bit more subtle with her manipulative behavior. She hesitated for a moment, clearly still suspicious, and asked Ava if she was treating me well. Ava didn't say a word, though a cold glint flashed in her eyes. She signed a simple no in response. Hannah seemed relieved, and then asked where I was and why I hadn't come with her. Ava was just about to respond when her phone began to vibrate incessantly in her pocket. She checked the screen, and a look of confusion and panic washed over her face. She gave Hannah a quick wave and hurried away. Under normal circumstances, I would have stayed in the corner and kept muttering insults at Ava. But as soon as she moved, I felt an invisible force yanking me along after her. I grumbled as I drifted through the air, annoyed that she had interrupted my internal rant about Ethan. Ava eventually found one of the colleagues who had been on the business trip with me. The colleague scratched his head and told her that I had returned home days ago on the same flight as him. Ava's brow furrowed even deeper, and her eyes mirrored a lake disturbed by a stone, waves of panic beginning to swell within them. She took a deep breath and typed out a question about when I had arrived back in Chicago. Her fingers were visibly trembling as she held the phone. The reply came back instantly, 4 days ago. When she read that, Ava's face turned a terrifying shade of white. Her pupils were blown wide with shock and confusion. She stood there frozen, her mouth slightly open as she tried to form words that wouldn't come. I put my hand to my forehead and stood right in front of her, tried to poke her head and tell her I was right there. I waved my hand back and forth in front of her face, a bitter sneer on my lips. I asked her what she wanted from me now. I suggested that maybe she should just join me in death so she could finally see me. Suddenly, my phone was flooded with a barrage of messages and one missed call after another. It seemed like Ava had finally realized that something was horribly wrong, and she began to search for me like a woman possessed. Since she couldn't speak or leave voicemails, and my phone went unanswered, she resorted to sending a non-stop stream of texts. She kept asking where I was. I just shook my head and told her I'd been by her side the entire time, even if she couldn't see me. Then she sent a message begging me to go home and promising she would find me there. The word home hit me like a physical blow. I froze for a few seconds before collapsing against the wall near her. I clenched my fists and whispered one word at a time that I couldn't go back home anymore. I told her that home was no longer an option for me. Ava went to my office, my parents' house, and tracked down every single friend and colleague she could think of. She went to every possible place she could imagine, but she still couldn't find me. Standing in the middle of a bustling city street, Ava gripped her phone, looking completely lost and helpless. She looked like she had no idea what to do next. The streetlights cast a long, lonely shadow behind her exhausted figure. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she looked as though she was on the verge of a total collapse. After searching all day, Ava finally returned home, having checked every possible hiding spot only to find nothing. The apartment was chillingly quiet and so empty that it didn't even produce an echo. Ava kept sending messages and poking my avatar. A notification appeared saying she had poked my tombstone along with a morbid message about the grass growing high over my grave. She stared at those words for a long time before she started scrolling back through all the different status messages I had set over the past few days. Standing behind her, I suddenly realized that none of this was fun anymore. I didn't even have the heart to try and scare her anymore. It finally hit me that Ava did care for me in her own way. The tragedy was simply that I wasn't the person she loved the most. I drifted in front of her and just watched her. Her brow was deeply furrowed, and her lips were pale and chapped. Even with the exhaustion written all over her face, she was still beautiful, possessing a sort of ethereal, cold grace. Memories began to flood back like a montage. During our first year, she had been so cold and distant. By the second year, she had started looking at me more often, her gaze lingering a little longer each time. In our third year, during a particularly snowy winter, I had traveled across the mountains to find her while she was out sketching. We had ended up trapped in a small cabin by the snow, and I'd spent the night holding her frozen hands to keep her warm. Then came the 4th year at the airport. Ava had been so out of breath that she forgot all about her usual reserved nature. She tied that bell around my wrist and signed with such intensity that she would wait for me forever if she had to. By the 7th year, I was carrying her toward the bedroom while she blushed furiously and snuggled into my chest. I closed my eyes now and silently told the system to end the mission, asking how much time I had left before my consciousness would be detached. The mechanical voice replied that I had a 3-day countdown. My phone screen lit up with a chime. I used my spectral influence to send Ava a message telling her that it was over, that I was moving on to someone else, and that I didn't need her anymore. Ava's fingers went rigid, and her brow tightened into a knot. Her eyes, which usually had the soft clarity of autumn water, seemed to freeze over instantly. Then, she called the police. I was fuming, pacing around the police station and yelling that I had clearly said we were breaking up. I couldn't understand why she was involving the police instead of just accepting it. After giving her statement, she sat there gripping a photo of me. She handed the picture to the officer, trying her best to keep from falling apart. I could sense the turmoil swirling inside her. She looked calm on the surface, but she was actually teetering on the edge of a total breakdown. The officer asked if she was sure I was actually missing and not just avoiding her, since she was still getting messages. Ava's eyes were bloodshot and terrifying, a clear sign that she hadn't slept in days. She looked down and typed that James Miller would never break up with her. She insisted that something terrible must have happened and that I was in danger, begging them to help. As soon as the paperwork was done, she couldn't wait to leave. She stood up immediately, clearly planning to resume her search for me on her own. Just as she was about to step out of the office, a voice from behind called out for her to wait. A young officer had been studying the photograph of me for several minutes. His expression suddenly shifted, and he urgently called out to get Ava's attention. He lowered his voice and carefully asked her to take a look at something, questioning if the person on the screen was the man she was looking for. Ava stood perfectly still as she looked in the direction he was pointing. Her eyes were glued to a figure in the bottom left corner of the monitor, and she seemed to freeze. I instinctively looked as well, and with just one glance, I recognized my own silhouette. It was me. The footage showed a raging sea of fire and people running in every direction. I was there, desperately shaking the bell on my wrist and screaming for help. And right there on the screen, Ava was pulling Ethan through the smoke with a blank expression, never once looking back toward me. The monitor was playing the security footage from a mall fire 4 days ago. I don't know how much time passed, but Ava looked as though all the blood had been drained from her body, her face becoming as pale as a sheet of paper. She opened her mouth, and from a throat that had been silent for so long, she managed to force out a few raspy, broken syllables of my name. The sound was harsh and grating, like a saw being dragged across broken violin strings. It felt as if the entire world was trembling and collapsing at the sound of her voice. In the days following the fire, Ava refused to eat or drink anything. She searched for me through the charred remains of the building with a desperate intensity. For a long time, I simply hovered over her shoulder, making mocking faces and pretending I didn't care at all. I let out a sigh and told her to stop because I was already dead. Despite my words, she maintained her usual mask of composure as she approached every person at the site to ask if they had seen James. She forced out every syllable with that new, grating voice of hers, struggling to make herself understood. It was clear that the news of my death couldn't be kept secret any longer. Soon, my old circle of friends began to arrive at the scene to pay their respects. Hannah Sullivan and a recently discharged Ethan Brooks showed up at the cordoned-off ruins together. I stared at the growing crowd and felt a strange loss for words, thinking about how ironic it was that everyone had finally gathered for my sake now that I was gone. My parents were the most devastated, sobbing so hard they could barely breathe and looking like they might collapse at any moment. Even my frenemy, Hannah, couldn't stop the tears from welling up in her eyes. Ava was the only one who didn't cry. She stood off to the side with a blank expression, her hands hanging limp though the backs of her fingers were covered in raw, bloody scratches where she had clawed at her own skin. Dried scabs and fresh cuts were layered over one another on her knuckles. Ethan looked at her with a face full of guilt and begged her to stop punishing herself. Ava turned her head slightly to the side and asked in a quiet rasp if he had seen James. Ethan was frozen in shock, unable to believe his ears as he asked her when she had regained her voice. She completely ignored his question and looked down, whispering to herself about how no one could find him. She wondered aloud if I was in pain, convinced that I must be suffering terribly. She kept repeating that she had come to take me home, but simply couldn't find me anywhere. On the 7th day after my death, my family held a funeral service, but Ava was nowhere to be seen. To be honest, I was glad she wasn't there, because I didn't want to hear the soul-crushing sobs of the people who loved me. I certainly didn't want to see my enemies standing around with fake sympathy or hidden smirks. I decided to just lie down on the bed and try to sleep. The system had promised that once I woke up, I would finally be transported back to the real world. I felt my spirit and my thoughts finally beginning to settle into a peaceful silence. I didn't expect Ava to suddenly appear by the bed and rip the covers back. Without saying a word, she climbed in and lay down right where I was. The sudden contact startled me so much that my spirit was instantly launched out of the bed. I flew several feet away from the bed and stared at her in disbelief. Ava had settled onto the side of the mattress where I used to sleep, completely taking over my space as if she belonged there. She pulled my old comforter up to her chin and buried her face in my pillow. I watched, mesmerized and frustrated, as her fingers repeatedly traced the fabric of the pillowcase. I ended up shouting insults at her in my head. I called her heartless for disturbing my very last moments of rest. Ava just lay there on her side in total silence. Her lips were cracked and her face was worn thin by exhaustion, yet she still possessed that same haunting beauty. She tucked her head down, clutching something tightly in her palm. Her teeth were clenched as she struggled to control her trembling lips, finally forcing my name out in a ragged breath. I drifted back to the edge of the bed and looked at her for a moment before looking away. The whole situation felt absurd to me. I asked her if this was supposed to be some kind of deathbed regret. I told her that even if she got a second chance at life, she would probably choose Ethan Brooks all over again. I told myself she was just a terrible person and tried to leave it at that, but I felt a strange pang of sadness in my chest. At least I was about to be free of this entire mess. James Miller was going to get a fresh start, and in my new life, there wouldn't be any room for an Ava. She didn't stay asleep for long before she got up and headed toward the kitchen. She started boiling a batch of dumplings, the very same ones I had messed up right before my trip. I was dragged along to the kitchen behind her, feeling completely baffled by what she was doing. Then it hit me that our last big fight had happened during the holidays. I had decided to surprise her by leaving work early to make a romantic dinner, which in my mind meant making dumplings from scratch. The result was a total disaster, a plate of what looked like culinary waste. She had just stared at the soggy, misshapen lumps with her chopsticks in hand, clearly afraid to take a single bite. I had been so offended at the time. I had done everything myself, from the filling to the dough, and she wouldn't even try one. I felt like she was completely disregarding my effort. My ego had been bruised, so I stormed out and tried to feed the whole mess to a stray dog in the alley. I told her I would rather give my food to a mangy dog than to her. Even the dog wouldn't touch them, just gave them a sniff and walked away. I was ready to lose my mind. But then Ava had brought the plate back inside and signed that she would eat them. I snapped back to the present. Ava was now serving 2 helpings of those same dumplings, and she even set a place for me at the table as if I were about to sit down. She slowly ate every single one of those ruined dumplings. When she finished, she looked at the empty chair across from her and whispered that it was delicious. My emotions were all over the place, and I told her she was losing her mind. After she finished the dishes, she just sat there staring at her phone, scrolling through our old messages for hours. Eventually, a small smile touched her lips. She looked up directly at the spot where I was floating and asked if I'd been with her the whole time. I froze in shock and instinctively dove behind the sofa to hide. Ava just stared into the empty space, the entire apartment feeling heavy with an overwhelming sense of grief. She looked up and gave a dry, hollow laugh, telling me to wait for her. I started backing away, wanting to get as far from her as possible. I frantically called out to the system, asking if I could leave yet. The system responded that since 7 days had passed since my death, the detachment process was beginning. The cold voice started the countdown, and then there was a long, sharp beep. Ava sat there with her head bowed, perfectly still as if she had fallen asleep. I took one final look at her before turning my back, determined not to feel even a shred of regret. In that exact moment, the spectral chill that usually surrounded her vanished. She snapped her head up, her eyes flooding with tears as she screamed my name. She lunged forward out of her chair, her hands clawing at the empty air as if she were trying to catch something before it disappeared forever. Her chest was heaving and her voice was a ragged mess. She doubled over and coughed up a spray of blood that stained her white dress a brilliant crimson. It didn't take long after that for the light to finally fade from her eyes. By that evening, a massive fire had broken out in a secluded villa on the outskirts of the city. Amidst the billowing black smoke, Ava was found clutching a small pendant, as if it were the only thing connecting her to me. Her final words were a plea for me to wait for her. When I finally opened my eyes again, the first thing I noticed was the sharp, sterile smell of a hospital. I was lying in a private room. A woman I didn't recognize was smiling at me, claiming to be my wife. I rubbed my throbbing temples, having absolutely no memory of who she was. Once I gathered the basic facts of my situation, I spent another week in the hospital recovering. On the morning I was supposed to be discharged, the cord holding the bell on my wrist suddenly came undone. The bell hit the floor with a bright chime and rolled away. I started to lean down to pick it up, but another hand reached it before I could. The girl's profile looked incredibly familiar, but I couldn't for the life of me remember where I had seen her before. She picked up the bell and froze the moment she saw it clearly. After a long silence, she handed the bell back to me with a soft, gentle smile and asked if it belonged to me. The man I love is named James Miller. I love him more than anything in this world. He is the only one for me. He never seemed to realize that he was actually the person I considered my true first love. I felt like I owed Ethan Brooks my life. Back when we were in the orphanage together, he had taken a blow that was meant for me and nearly died right in front of my eyes. I didn't have anyone else in the world, so I figured dedicating my life to Ethan was a fair trade. I started taking care of him, and over time, being there for him just became second nature to me. When Ethan eventually asked me to pretend to be his girlfriend, I just nodded and went along with it. Back then, the idea of romance didn't mean anything to me, and it didn't really matter who I was with. Everything changed the moment I met James Miller. He was under the impression that we had met for the first time at his gala. He was so transparent that I could read every single one of his thoughts just by looking at his face. He tried to act all cool and mysterious, tilting his chin up as he asked for my name. My desolate, lonely existence was suddenly flooded with light, a light that felt as fresh and bright as a summer morning. He was such a wonderful person that I felt completely unworthy of him. James was the most vibrant and bold part of my entire world. The very first time I laid eyes on him, my heart, which had felt like a stagnant pool of water, finally skipped a beat. I fell for him instantly. I loved him, but I was haunted by the fact that I couldn't speak and that I simply wasn't good enough for him. For a while, my life felt like a beautiful dream where he would hold me and kiss me. But I felt like I could only truly be with James after I'd finally paid back my debt to Ethan. I believed that by saving Ethan, I had finally settled my debt. I thought that from that moment on, my life, my body, and my soul could belong solely to James Miller. But instead of peace, I was plagued by a terrible sense of unease and horrific nightmares. I kept dreaming of James dying, unable to call for help as he was slowly consumed by the flames. I would wake up drenched in sweat only to realize that the nightmare was actually my reality. I felt like I'd been cast into the deepest pit of hell. I didn't care about my own suffering, but the thought of what James went through was unbearable. I knew he must have been in so much pain, and yet I couldn't find him anywhere. If that was the case, I decided I might as well just let the darkness take me too. My creator, the Master, had given me a single mission, which was to break James and Ava apart by any means necessary. My goal was to make Ava look like a heartless, terrible person in his eyes. She hadn't been able to separate them in the real world, but she had total control within this virtual reality. Because of this, she forced James and Ava to go through 10 different lifetimes together. In every single life, no matter how much the odds were stacked against them or how different their social standing was, they always found their way back to each other. This made the Master absolutely livid. In this final iteration, she went to great lengths to give Ava a different man to depend on. Yet, James Miller still fell head over heels for her the moment they met. They managed to navigate through endless misunderstandings and eventually found happiness together. To force James to give up on her forever, the Master decided to take more drastic measures. On the day the mall went up in flames, my core system received a cold, heartless order to completely block Ava's ability to perceive James. From that moment on, James became completely invisible to her. She couldn't hear his desperate cries for help either. It turned what should have been a happy life into James Miller's most horrific nightmare. My creator always claimed that she was in love with James, but I couldn't wrap my head around that. I am just a collection of data and don't understand human emotions, but I found myself wondering if this was what love really looked like. I remember hearing once that if you love someone, you should be afraid of them getting hurt. If she truly loved him, I couldn't understand how she could stand to watch him suffer such a gruesome death. Regardless, the plan worked perfectly. The perceived betrayal of his death caused James's love for Ava to crumble. I had successfully torn them apart and completed my mission exactly as ordered. On the night of the second fire, I watched Ava choose to end her own life in the flames, desperate to reunite with her James. In that moment, for the very first time, my data streams were flooded with errors and glitches. Once back in the real world, I hovered invisibly in the air. James had just been discharged from the hospital and was standing next to the Master, who was still pretending to be his wife. Meanwhile, Ava was standing by another exit across the hall. They were like two parallel lines destined to never meet, about to pass each other in the corridor without a word. My internal processing began to glitch again, filling with unreadable code that made no sense. This was far beyond the logic and parameters I had been programmed with. It felt as though some invisible force called fate was taking over. I used every last bit of my power to focus on the small bells they were both wearing on their wrists. The knots finally gave way, and a flood of long-buried emotions began to surge back into their hearts. I whispered a final goodbye to James Miller, hoping that his new life would be peaceful and free from any more pain. He spent 10 lifetimes pursuing her only to meet a gruesome end in this final cycle. He died believing she had abandoned him, never knowing that she was actually unable to see him because the system had blocked her senses. She carried the burden of a life she felt she owed to someone else, believing she had to pay that debt in full before she could truly deserve to love James. He spent 7 days as a spirit consumed by his own hatred while she chose to end her life in a massive fire just to find her way back to him. The most heartbreaking part isn't that the love was one-sided, but that we were truly meant for each other, yet remained separated by an entire world of cruel misunderstandings.